I've never been a fan of calling ahead to announce my arrival. There's just something about the element of surprise that I've loved since I was a young man. My wife, Martha, usually has this way of looking at me when I walk through the door earlier than expected. Her eyes widen, a huge smile breaks across her face, and for a second, it feels like we're back in our 20s again. We've been married for 42 years, but that spark hasn't faded one bit. Before I get into the thick of what happened that December, I have to ask a small favor of you. If you're enjoying this story, please let me know in the comments where you're reading from, and don't forget to like and follow for more. Your support truly means the world to me. The day everything changed was December 21st. I was working as a courier, a job I took up after my body decided it couldn't handle the heavy lifting of construction work anymore. At 65, carrying bags of cement and climbing ladders all day just wasn't an option. I had finished my deliveries early and was feeling good about the day. The town was quiet, and all I could think about was getting home to start the holiday preparations with Martha. Christmas has always been our favorite time of year, though it's gotten a bit quieter since our only son, Julian, married Chloe and moved out. As I was packing up my gear at the depot, my buddy Pete, another driver, walked over. "Elias, heading out already? It's only 3:30, he said with a grin. I tucked my phone into my pocket and nodded. "I've done my rounds for the day, Pete. I want to get home and surprise Martha." Pete just laughed and gave me a friendly slap on the shoulder. "Over 40 years and you're still playing the romantic? You're a good man, Elias." I climbed into my old SUV and started the drive home. As I drove through the familiar streets, I couldn't help but look at the houses we passed and think about the life Martha and I had built. Our house wasn't huge or fancy, but it was ours. I had spent 30 years fixing it up, one room at a time, often working late into the night after a full shift at the construction site. Martha had done her part too, taking on extra sewing and laundry work for the neighbors so we could afford the best materials. Every floorboard and every coat of paint represented our shared sweat and sacrifice. When I finally turned the corner onto our street, I noticed something that immediately felt off. There was a sleek, black sedan, a brand new model I didn't recognize, parked right in front of our driveway, and pulled up right behind it was Julian's truck. Now, I wasn't expecting to see my son until Christmas Eve, 3 days away. Julian never just dropped by without a phone call or a text, and he certainly didn't hang out with people who drove cars like that. I decided to park half a block away and walk the rest of the distance. I can't explain it, but my gut was telling me that something was wrong. As I got closer to the house, I could hear the muffled sounds of people talking inside. There was laughter, the sound of glasses clinking, and the general noise of a party I hadn't been invited to. But what stopped me dead in my tracks wasn't the noise from inside. It was Martha. She was sitting all alone on the small wooden bench we kept on the porch near the front door. Her head was bowed, and I could see her shoulders shaking. My heart sank. She was crying. I approached her as quietly as I could, my pulse racing with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. I knelt down in front of her and whispered, "Martha? Honey, what's happened? Why are you out here?" She looked up, and the expression on her face broke my heart. Her eyes were red and puffed up from crying, and she looked genuinely startled to see me. "Elias!" she gasped in a low, shaky voice, quickly trying to wipe the tears from her cheeks. I wasn't expecting you home yet. Talk to me?" I insisted, taking her hands in mine. They were ice cold, even though the afternoon air was warm. She kept glancing nervously toward the front door, which was slightly ajar. From inside, the lively conversation continued. But then I heard a voice that made my blood run cold. It was Julian, and he sounded frustrated. "Come on, Mom. Don't make this a whole thing," he was shouting from the living room. "It's just a simple signature. Mr. and Mrs. Thorne came all this way to help us get the paperwork sorted. They're doing us a favor." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Paperwork? Signatures? And who were these Thornes? I looked back at Martha, my voice barely a whisper now. "What papers is he talking about, Martha?" She gripped my hand so hard it actually hurt, and for the first time in 40 years, I saw true fear in her eyes. "They've been here for hours, Elias," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Julian, Chloe, and Chloe's parents, the Thornes. They brought drinks and food, acting like it was just a holiday visit. But then they started talking about the house and the future and how we aren't getting any younger." She stopped abruptly when we heard footsteps approaching the front door. I stood up quickly and moved to the side, pressing myself against one of the porch pillars so I was partially hidden from view. The front door swung open, and Julian stepped out. He's 35 now, and he's always looked a lot like me, but in that moment I didn't recognize the man standing there. There was a hardness in his eyes that had grown ever since he started spending time with Chloe's family. He didn't see me. He just looked down at his mother with an expression of pure impatience. "Mom, stop being difficult," he said. "We just need you to sign the property transfer and the power of attorney. It's for your own protection. The house will be much safer in our names than with two people who are clearly struggling to keep up with things." I felt like the world had stopped spinning. Property transfer? Power of attorney? They were trying to take our home. I couldn't stay hidden for another second. "What exactly are you asking your mother to sign, Julian?" I asked, stepping out into the light. My son jumped so hard he nearly tripped over the doorstep. His face turned from a flush of anger to a ghostly white in less than a second. "Dad, I didn't know you were back," he stammered, his eyes darting back toward the living room. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough to hear you trying to swindle your mother," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Now I want a clear answer. What is this about a transfer? What are you trying to do to our home?" Before Julian could even attempt a lie, a woman appeared behind him in the doorway. It was Chloe, wearing a smile that looked like it had been painted on by someone who didn't know what happiness felt like. "Why, Elias, what a wonderful surprise," she chirped with fake enthusiasm. "We were just talking about you." Behind her, two more people emerged from the shadows of our hallway. Silas Thorne was a large man, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my SUV, and his wife, Evelyn, was draped in expensive-looking jewelry that seemed to weigh her down. "Elias, it's a pleasure to finally see you," Silas said, extending a hand as if he were the host and I was the guest in my own home. I didn't take it. I just stared at my son and waited. I stood there in the doorway of the home I had spent my life building, staring down my own son. I ignored the hand Silas Thorne had extended toward me, keeping my eyes fixed on Julian. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Julian," I said, my voice steady but thick with a cold fury. "What are these papers you're trying to force on your mother?" Julian looked away for a split second, glancing at his father-in-law for some kind of cue before he finally met my gaze. "Dad, you're overreacting," he said, trying to put on a calm, reasonable voice that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We just want to make sure the family's future is secure." He took a step toward me, gesturing with his hands as if he were explaining something simple to a child. "Look at your job, Dad. You're out there driving all day, And let's be honest, you're not as young as you used to be. We're just worried that if something happens to you, the bank or the city might find a way to take this place. If the house is in our names, it's protected. I felt the air leave my lungs for a moment, but it wasn't out of fear. It was pure, unadulterated shock. In your names, I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. This house? The one I laid every single brick for? The one your mother and I spent 40 years paying for with every extra cent we had. I looked around the living room, at the walls I'd painted and the floors I'd polished, feeling a deep sense of violation. That was when Silas Thorne decided to chime in, his voice dripping with a condescending tone that made me want to clench my fists. Now, Elias, let's not get emotional. I think you're misinterpreting a very standard legal strategy, he said, adjusting his expensive cuffs. My daughter and son-in-law are just looking out for the family assets. I have contacts, very influential people, who can ensure that everything is handled properly so you two don't have to worry about the logistics of property taxes or maintenance anymore. Logistics? I scoffed, turning my glare toward him. The house is paid off. The deed is in our safe. The taxes are up to date. There are no logistics to handle other than living our lives. I turned back to Julian, noticing the slight glassy look in his eyes and the way he wobbled just a tiny bit as he stood there. He'd been drinking their beer while he tried to talk his mother out of her life's work. Dad, you're being stubborn, Julian snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. You're 65. You're driving a courier van. What happens when you can't work? How will you keep up with the repairs? How will you pay for the insurance? I felt Martha's hand on my arm again, a gentle squeeze that I knew was her way of asking me to keep my temper. I took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. Your mother and I have been planning for our retirement since before you were born, Julian, I said as calmly as I could. We have our savings, we have my pension, and we have this roof over our heads. We don't need anyone to protect us from what we already own. Evelyn Thorne, who had been standing quietly by the window, suddenly stepped forward with a practiced, motherly smile that felt entirely hollow. Oh, Elias, we only want what's best for everyone, she said softly. Imagine if you put the house in Julian and Chloe's names. You could stay right here, live your lives in peace, and never have to worry about a single bill or repair again. Chloe nodded eagerly beside her mother, looking over at Martha. Martha, you seemed to understand earlier. Why are you hesitating now? She asked. I saw Martha look down at her lap, a look of deep shame crossing her face, and that was the breaking point for me. They had been ganging up on her, pressuring her for hours while I was away, taking advantage of her kind heart. I stepped forward, placing myself firmly between them and my wife. Nobody is signing a single thing, I said, my voice ringing through the room. And I am going to ask all of you to leave my property. Right now. The friendly mask Silas was wearing finally slipped, revealing a look of pure disgust. I think you're making a very big mistake, Elias, he said, his voice dropping to a low threat. We're trying to help you. If you want to be difficult, you might find that the world isn't as kind to people your age as you think it is. If you want to help, I replied, staring him straight in the eye, you can start by respecting our home and our decisions. Julian stepped toward me, his face red with a mix of anger and booze. Dad, you're ruining everything, he shouted. Silas has connections. If the house is in our name, we can use it as collateral to get a loan for a new business project. We could expand the place, make it better for everyone. And there it was. The truth finally came out. They didn't want to protect our future. They wanted to use our home to fund their own gambles. They were willing to risk the only thing we had so they could get a head start on some business deal. "Julian, look at me," I said, my heart feeling heavier than it ever had. "This house is not for sale. It's not for a loan. And it's not going into anyone's name but ours. Now, get your things and leave." There was a long, tense silence where nobody moved. Then Silas let out a short, dry laugh. "Let's go, everyone," he said, gesturing toward the door. "It seems Elias needs some time to think things over when he's not so emotional. We'll talk another day when he's more receptive to reality." Chloe grabbed Julian's arm, pulling him toward the hallway. As they passed me, Julian looked at me with a look that was part rage and part something else. Maybe shame, though it was hard to tell. "You're making a mistake, Dad," he muttered. They went back into the house to gather their coats and bags. I took that chance to lean down and talk to Martha. "Did you sign anything?" I asked, my voice full of worry. She shook her head, tears starting to fall again. "No, but Elias, they were so insistent. They kept telling me it was for the best, that we'd be protected." For a moment, I almost believed them. I pulled her into a tight hug, feeling how much she was trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. Don't you ever apologize for their greed, Martha," I said, holding her close. In that moment, I made a silent vow that nobody, not even our own son, would ever make her feel like a prisoner in her own home again. A few minutes later, the four of them walked out the front door. Silas gave me one last look, a cold, calculating stare that told me this wasn't over. "The offer is still on the table, Elias. Think about it," he said before walking down the porch steps. Julian paused by his truck, looking back for a second. "I'm sorry you feel this way, Dad," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "I was just thinking about the future." "We'll decide our own future, Julian," I said, "and I hope you never try something like this again." He just nodded and got into his truck. As I watched them drive away, a heavy sense of dread settled in my chest. Something told me that was just the opening shot of a war I never wanted to fight. We went back inside, and I saw the kitchen table was still covered in half-empty bottles and a stack of papers they'd left behind. I picked them up, and my heart skipped a beat. They weren't just rough notes. They were official-looking drafts for a power of attorney and a property transfer, already printed on a notary's letterhead. "They had this all planned," I whispered, showing the papers to Martha. She looked at them with horror. "I'm scared, Elias," she confessed, her voice small. "The way they talked to us, like we were just useless old people who couldn't think for ourselves anymore." I kissed her forehead and held her tight, but my mind was already racing. I needed to act fast. I wasn't going to let them take what we had built. I remembered an old friend, Martin, who was a captain in the local police, and I thought about a lawyer I'd heard good things about. This war was just beginning, and I had no intention of losing it. I didn't sleep a wink that night. While Martha breathed restlessly beside me, my head wouldn't stop spinning, replaying the events of the afternoon over and over. The image of my son toasting with his in-laws while my wife cried alone on the porch burned inside me like acid. I couldn't wrap my head around how Julian, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and play fair, could turn into someone willing to trick his own mother out of her home. I got up before the sun was even a thought and made a pot of coffee. Sitting at our small kitchen table with a hot cup in my hands, I felt a heavy weight of responsibility. I couldn't just sit and wait for them to make the next move. I picked up my cell phone and called Pete. "Elias?" he answered, his voice thick with sleep. What's wrong? It's barely 5 a.m. I need a huge favor, my friend, I said. Can you cover my delivery route today? I have some urgent business to take care of. There was a brief silence on the other end. Of course, Elias, Pete said, sounding more awake now. Is everything okay with Martha? I'll tell you everything later, I replied, not wanting to get into the painful details over the phone. I owe you one, Pete. As I hung up, I felt a pair of hands on my shoulders. I hadn't even heard Martha get up. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. Where are you going so early? She asked softly. I'm going to make sure no one takes what's ours, I told her, reaching across the table to take her hand. Trust me, honey. Martha looked at me with those eyes that, even after 42 years, made me feel like she could see right through my skin to my very thoughts. Be careful, Elias, she said finally. I know that look on your face. You're ready for a fight. I gave her a small smile, even though inside I felt a mix of anger and determination I hadn't felt in decades. I'm always careful, I assured her, leaning over to kiss her forehead before I grabbed my jacket. But I'm not going to stand by and do nothing while they plot against us. My first stop was the local police station. The building was an old single-story place with peeling paint, and it was just starting to buzz with the morning shift change when I pulled into the lot. I didn't have to wait long before I heard a familiar voice behind me. Elias? What brings you here at the crack of dawn? I turned around and saw Martin. We had grown up together in the same neighborhood. He'd gone into the police academy while I went into construction, but our lives had stayed connected over the years, especially when our kids were in school together. He motioned toward his office. Come on in. I just made a fresh pot. Once we were behind his closed door, I told him everything that had happened the day before. The surprise visit, the drinking, the tears, and the papers Silas Thorne was pushing on us. Martin's face hardened as the story came out. I know the Thornes, he said, leaning back in his chair. Silas acts like a big-shot businessman, but he has a reputation around town for taking advantage of people when they're at their most vulnerable. He paused for a moment, looking at me with a mix of sympathy and honesty. And about Julian, I'm sorry to say it, Elias, but your son has a habit of looking for the easy way out. I wasn't offended because I knew Martin was just telling the truth I'd been trying to ignore. What can I do, Martin? I asked. I'm worried they'll come back and pressure Martha when I'm out working. Legally, my hands are tied until they actually commit a crime, he admitted. But I can have my guys drive by your house more often on their patrols. And if they even step foot on your porch and you feel threatened, you call me immediately. I thanked him, but I knew I needed more than just a police presence. I needed a legal shield. Do you know a lawyer named Jessica Castida? I asked. Jessica? Absolutely. She's top-notch, Martin said. She's helped a few of the guys here with property and inheritance issues. Her office is right near the town market. I headed straight there. To my surprise, the lights were already on despite the early hour. I knocked on the frosted glass door, and a young woman invited me in. Jessica Castida was younger than I expected, probably in her mid-30s, with her hair pulled back in a sharp bun and eyes that seemed to miss nothing behind her glasses. I laid out the whole situation for her. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she took off her glasses and sighed. Elias, what you're describing is unfortunately very common, she said. It's a form of elder abuse, children or relatives pressuring seniors to sign over their assets, sometimes with lies and sometimes with subtle threats. How do I stop them? I asked. First, we need to look at your existing documents, she said. Do you have a will? I made one about 10 years ago, I said. Julian is our only child, so we left everything to him. We need to change that immediately, she said firmly. And we need to revoke any power of attorney your son might have. But we haven't given him any power of attorney, I argued. Jessica looked at me intently. Are you absolutely sure? Sometimes these things are signed without people fully understanding what they are. Is it possible Martha signed something without your knowledge? A chill ran down my spine. Martha had told me she didn't sign anything yesterday, but what about months ago? I didn't know for sure. Let's check, Jessica said, picking up her office phone. I know the notaries in this town. I'll have them verify if there's anything registered in Julian's or Chloe's names. While she made her calls, I gave her all the information about our other assets. Our modest savings and a small plot of land on the edge of town we'd bought for our retirement. After about an hour, her phone rang. She listened for a moment, her expression turning very serious. When she hung up, she looked at me with a grim expression. Elias, we have a problem, she said. According to the notary's records, a general power of attorney was registered 6 months ago in Julian's favor, signed by Martha. I felt the floor drop out from under me. That's impossible, I stammered. Martha would never do that without talking to me. The notary says the signature looks authentic, Jessica said, pausing for a moment. Elias, does Martha sign all her own papers, or do you sometimes sign for her? The question caught me off guard, but I had to be honest. Sometimes I sign for her, I admitted, just for routine stuff when she's busy or not feeling well. We have very similar handwriting. Jessica nodded as if she'd expected that. Is it possible someone forged her signature? Or maybe they had her sign something by telling her it was a different document. Either way, she continued, we are going to revoke that power of attorney right now and file a formal complaint for possible forgery. We spent the rest of the morning running between notary offices, formalizing the revocation and setting up a trust for our house. A trust would ensure that the property was protected and that Martha could live there for the rest of her life, no matter what happened. We also updated the will, explicitly stating that any attempt at manipulation would disqualify Julian as an heir. Before I left, Jessica gave me one last piece of advice. Elias, you need proof of what they're trying to do. If they pressure you again, record the conversation. She showed me how to set up a recording app on my phone that I could activate discreetly. She handed me a folder with all our new documents. Keep these in a safe place and always keep a copy with you. I left her office feeling stronger, but deeply saddened. I never thought I'd have to hire a lawyer to protect myself from my own flesh and blood. As I was driving back, my phone rang. It was Martha. Elias, she said, her voice sounding tight and nervous. Julian just called. He's coming over with Silas Thorne. They say they have something important to show us. Don't open the door, Martha, I said, my heart starting to pound. I'm 10 minutes away. Don't let them in until I get there. I already told them I'm not alone, she said. I told them the locksmith is here fixing a latch. I smiled despite the stress. Martha was smarter than people gave her credit for. I sped up, ready to face whatever they had planned. I pulled up to the house with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sure enough, Julian's truck was parked right out front, and that sleek black sedan belonging to Silas Thorne was idling right next to it. Seeing those vehicles in my driveway felt like seeing a predator circling its prey. Before I even turned off the engine, I took a deep breath to steady my hands. I remembered exactly what Jessica, the lawyer, had told me. I reached for my phone and opened the recording app, making sure it was active before sliding it carefully into my front shirt pocket. I checked the mirror to ensure the microphone wasn't blocked by the fabric. I needed every word they were about to say to be crystal clear. When I stepped through the front door, the air in the living room felt thick enough to choke on. Martha was standing near the kitchen counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the wood. She looked relieved the moment she saw me, but she still had that haunted look in her eyes. Julian and Silas were already made themselves comfortable at our dining table, with several stacks of papers spread out in front of them like they already owned the place. Chloe and her mother weren't there this time. It was just the men, ready to do the heavy lifting. "Dad, glad you're finally here," Julian said, standing up with a smile that felt entirely too forced. "I was just telling Mom that we've been doing some thinking. We're really worried about you both." "Worried?" I asked, walking over to Martha and taking her hand. I could feel her trembling. "About what exactly?" Silas cleared his throat, leaning back in the chair I'd bought with my first big bonus 20 years ago. "Elias, I think you might have misunderstood our intentions yesterday. We don't want to take anything from you. On the contrary, we want to protect you." "Protect us from what?" I pressed, keeping my voice neutral as I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. Julian stepped in, his tone becoming that of a concerned, dutiful son. "Dad, there are people out there who take advantage of the elderly. Scammers, shady neighbors, even the government can seize properties if they aren't properly shielded by a legal entity." It was a blatant lie, a classic scare tactic designed to make us feel helpless. I felt a surge of indignation, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wanted to see exactly how far they would go. "And how exactly does putting the house in your name protect us?" I asked. Silas pushed a document toward me. "It's very simple. If the property is held by a corporation that we manage, it's shielded from outside claims. You two would continue to live here, of course, but legally you'd be far safer." I picked up the papers and glanced over the fine print. It wasn't a protection plan. It was a sales contract disguised as asset management. The clauses were so predatory they made my blood boil. If we signed this, we'd effectively become tenants in our own home, liable to be evicted at their whim. "And you put this together, Silas?" I asked. "A lawyer friend of mine did," he replied proudly. "He handles the assets for some of the most influential families in the state." I looked at Julian. "And you agree with this? You think this is the right move for your mother and me?" Julian didn't even blink. "It's for the good of everyone, Dad. Plus, Silas has offered me a real position in his firm once we get this arrangement finalized. It's an executive role with a salary that would finally let me take care of things the right way." There it was. The price of our home was a fancy title and a paycheck for my son. He was willing to strip his parents of their only asset just to skip the hard work of building a career on his own. I looked at him, feeling a deep, hollow sadness. "How long have you been out of work, Julian?" His face darkened instantly. "I'm not out of work. I'm between projects. And I've been helping Silas with some real estate developments." "Real estate?" I prompted. "In this neighborhood?" Silas waved a hand dismissively. "There's a lot of potential here. This town is starting to attract outside investors. We just want to make sure you're positioned to benefit from that." They weren't just looking for collateral. They were planning to flip our house the moment they got the chance. "I understand perfectly," I said, letting a bit of a conciliatory tone creep into my voice. I saw a flash of triumph in Silas's eyes, and Julian visibly relaxed, thinking he'd finally won me over. You're right. We do need to protect the family assets. I'm glad you've come around, Dad, Julian said, reaching for a pen. In fact, I continued, I spent the entire morning doing exactly that. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder Jessica had given me. I laid the documents on the table, right on top of their predatory contract. Martha and I have placed this house into an irrevocable trust. It's legally locked down. We also officially revoked that power of attorney my wife supposedly signed 6 months ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian's jaw dropped, and Silas stiffened as if I'd just slapped him. What did you do? Julian whispered, his face turning a mottled red. I protected what's ours, I replied firmly. And since we're being honest, we've also filed a formal police complaint regarding the forgery of Martha's signature on that old power of attorney. Jessica Castida is handling the legal side of things from here on out. Silas stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. He began gathering his papers with shaking hands. I don't think you're thinking clearly, Elias, he said, his voice now a low, dangerous snarl. We could have reached a beneficial agreement. There is no agreement that involves you taking my house that I would ever call beneficial, I said, standing my ground. Now, I'm going to ask you to leave my property. Julian looked at me with a mix of rage and genuine shock. Dad, you're making a massive mistake. Silas has friends everywhere. And I have this entire conversation recorded. Silas, I said, pulling the phone out of my pocket and showing them the active screen. Every threat, every lie, and every admission of your plans is right here. My lawyer suggested I gather evidence, and you've been very helpful today. Silas turned pale, and Julian looked like he'd been struck dumb. They didn't say another word as they scrambled out of the house. Julian lingered for just a second on the porch, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, shame, maybe, or just the realization that his easy payday had vanished. I'm your son, Dad, he muttered. And that's why this hurts so much, Julian, I replied. Once they were gone, Martha collapsed into my arms, sobbing with relief. I held her tight, but I knew we couldn't just celebrate yet. I looked out the window and saw Julian and Silas standing by their cars, arguing heatedly. They weren't giving up. They were just changing tactics. That night, I called Mr. S. the best locksmith in town. I'd known him for years from the construction days. He arrived an hour later with a heavy toolbox and a no-nonsense attitude. Changing everything, Elias? He asked as he began dismantling the front door lock. Everything, I confirmed. I told him the basics of what was happening. He nodded knowingly, mentioning he'd seen similar cases where relatives tried to force their way into elderly parents' homes. Don't you worry, Martha, Mr. S. said, seeing her anxious face. These new deadbolts are impossible to pick, and I'm going to install these high-definition cameras at the front and back doors. They link directly to your phones. If anyone even breathes on your porch, you'll get an alert. By 10 p.m., the house was a fortress. Mr. S. handed me 3 sets of keys. Keep the third one hidden somewhere safe, he advised. I paid him extra for the late hours and the peace of mind. As Martha and I sat in the living room afterward, the silence felt different. Heavier, but safer. Do you really think he'd try to break in? She asked softly. I looked at the new keys on the table. I hope not, honey. But I'm not taking any more chances with our life's work. I spent the rest of the night uploading the recording to the cloud and emailing a copy to Jessica, just like she taught me. We were ready for whatever came next. The next morning, I decided to head back to work just like any other day. I knew we needed to stick to our routine, so we didn't give Julian and Silas any more reason to suspect we were onto their every move. Beyond that, I knew from experience that legal battles, even the most righteous ones, end up costing a small fortune, and I needed to keep the money coming in. It was a standard, quiet day on the job. I spent my hours crisscrossing the town, delivering packages to tourists at the local hotels and ending the shift with a long haul to the neighboring county. By the time I started heading back to our neighborhood, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, orange shadows across the road. As I turned onto our street, that familiar sense of dread returned. Parked a few doors down from my house were two vehicles I didn't recognize. A white Volkswagen and a bright red Jeep. Neither belonged to Julian or Silas, but my gut told me they were connected. I decided to play it safe. I parked half a block away and approached on foot, staying close to the shadows of the trees. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a notification from the security app Mr. S had installed the night before. There was movement at my front door. I pulled up the live feed, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Chloe was standing on our porch, banging on the door with her fist. Next to her stood a man and a woman I'd never seen before. The woman was dressed in a stiff, professional suit and was clutching a heavy leather briefcase. I immediately dialed the house. Martha picked up on the second ring, her voice sounding thin and terrified. "Elias, where are you?" she whispered. "I'm right outside, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I see Chloe on the porch. Who are those people with her?" "She says they're a social worker and a doctor," Martha replied, her voice breaking. "She says they're here to do an evaluation of our mental capacity to handle our own affairs. She told me Julian is deeply concerned about us." A wave of pure rage washed over me. This was their new play. If they couldn't trick us into signing the house away, they would try to have us declared incompetent so they could simply take control. "Do not open that door, Martha," I ordered. "No matter what they say, keep it locked. Call Jessica right now. Her number is in the kitchen notebook. Tell her exactly what's happening." "I already called her, Elias," Martha said, and I could hear a flicker of her usual strength returning. "She told me the same thing. Don't let them in. She's on her way." "Good. Now call Martin," I said. "I'm going to go talk to them. I'll be there in 2 minutes." I hung up and moved toward the house, keeping out of sight behind the large oak tree on the corner. From there, I could hear Chloe's voice rising in volume. "Martha, we know you're in there," she shouted, hitting the door again. "We just want to help you. If you don't cooperate, we'll have no choice but to call the authorities." I noticed the man standing next to her was holding his phone up, recording the entire interaction. They were clearly trying to build a case that we were uncooperative or confused to use against us later. I couldn't stand by and watch it any longer. I stepped out from behind the tree and walked up the driveway with firm, heavy steps. "Can someone explain to me why you're harassing my wife on our private property?" I asked, my voice booming across the lawn. The three of them spun around, looking genuinely startled. Chloe recovered her composure in a heartbeat, flashing that same artificial, painted-on smile. "Elias, we were just hoping to catch you," she chirped. "I'd like you to meet Monica Vega, a social worker, and Dr. Ramirez. They're here for a routine evaluation." "A routine evaluation?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Ordered by who? Because neither I nor my wife requested any such thing. The woman, Monica, took a step forward, adjusting her glasses with a rehearsed, serious expression. Mr. Elias, your son Julian has expressed serious concerns regarding your well-being, she said. As part of the standard protocol, we are required to conduct a brief evaluation to ensure you are both safe. What government agency are you with, Ms. Vega? I interrupted, noticing she wasn't wearing any official city or county identification. She faltered for a second, her professional mask slipping just a fraction. We work with a private assistance program, she replied vaguely. Your son hired us to provide a comprehensive report. Then you have absolutely no legal authority to be on this porch, I concluded firmly. I'm going to ask you to leave my property immediately. The man, the supposed doctor, finally spoke up. Mr. Elias, we understand this is stressful, but it's truly for your own good, he said in a calm, patronizing tone. We just want to verify that you and your wife are in a condition to manage your personal affairs. It's a standard procedure for people of your age. Indignation burned in my chest, but I remembered the phone in my pocket. I forced myself to stay calm, so I wouldn't give them any erratic behavior to record. And what was your name again, Doctor? Ramirez. Dr. Philip Ramirez, he said, though I caught a hint of hesitation in his voice. I'd like to see your medical license, Dr. Ramirez, I said. I'm sure you have it on you, considering you're here on official business. The man became visibly nervous, shifting his weight from side to side. It's in the car. I could go get it. That won't be necessary. A sharp, firm voice interrupted from the sidewalk. We all turned to see Jessica Castida walking up the driveway with a look of absolute purpose. Right behind her were Captain Martin and another uniformed officer. Ms. Vega, Mr. Ramirez, Jessica said, her voice like a whip. She clearly knew exactly who they were. I'm afraid you are treading on very dangerous legal ground here. Harassment, trespassing, and impersonating public officials are all very serious charges. The social worker lost her cool entirely, her face turning a pale shade of gray. We were just. Save it for the station. Jessica cut her off. You can explain your private program to the captain while he verifies your professional credentials, which I highly doubt you actually possess. Martin stepped up to the porch, his presence commanding the space. I'm going to need all three of you to accompany us to the station to verify your identities, he said with the authority only a man in uniform can carry. And I'll be taking that phone you were using to record without consent as evidence. Chloe looked like she wanted to protest, but one look at Martin's face silenced her. The three of them were led away to the waiting patrol car. Jessica walked over to me, her expression softening. Elias, this is exactly what I was afraid of, she said quietly. They're getting desperate. They're looking for any crack in the armor to declare you incompetent. Who are those people, really? I asked, watching the patrol car pull away. The woman works for a firm that specializes in shady inheritance disputes, Jessica explained. The man? I doubt he's ever seen the inside of a medical school. And Chloe knows exactly what she's doing, I added, feeling a cold knot in my stomach. Jessica nodded gravely. This is going to escalate, Elias. We need to get ahead of them. We need to prove, once and for all, that you and Martha are in full possession of your faculties. We went into the house to check on Martha, who was shaken but remarkably firm. We sat in the living room and Jessica laid out the plan. They'll try this again, maybe with real officials next time, she warned. Tomorrow, I'm taking both of you to a top-tier geriatric specialist and a forensic psychologist. We're going to get independent, ironclad reports certifying your mental health. If they try to take this to court, we'll be ready to shut them down instantly. I looked at Martha, and she nodded, her eyes filled with a new kind of determination. We weren't just defending a house anymore. We were defending our right to exist as independent adults. The next day was a whirlwind of appointments that I never imagined I'd have to attend. Just as Jessica had arranged, Martha and I spent the morning being poked, prodded, and questioned by a top-tier geriatrician and a forensic psychologist. It was an exhausting process. They asked us about everything: our daily routines, how we managed our finances, our memories of the past, and our ability to understand complex legal documents. I'll admit, sitting in those sterile offices felt a bit demeaning at first, like we were children having to prove we could cross the street by ourselves. But as the hours went by, I realized how vital these reports were going to be. When the forensic psychologist, a kind, older man with a gentle voice, finally closed his folder, he gave us a reassuring smile. It's clear to me that both of you are not only perfectly lucid, but you are also more than capable of making informed, complex decisions for yourselves, he said firmly. I will have my formal report delivered to Ms. Castida by tomorrow morning. Hearing those words felt like a massive weight being lifted off my chest. We weren't useless old people. No matter what Julian and the Thorns tried to tell the world. On the way home, I made a detour to the transport depot. I needed to speak with Pete, my fellow driver. We had worked together for over 15 years, and he had been a pillar of support ever since his own wife had passed away a few years back. I found him leaning against his truck, sipping a coffee between deliveries. "Elias, how did the appointments go?" he asked, waving me over. I sat down next to him on a bench and told him everything: the medical evaluations, the forgery, and the attempt by Chloe to bring a fake doctor to our door. Pete listened in stunned silence, his face shifting from disbelief to genuine outrage. "Your own son did this? For a house?" he asked, shaking his head. "It's not just the house, Pete. It's the easy money and the pressure from his in-laws." I sighed. "But that's why I'm here." Jessica suggested something called an advanced directive. I explained the concept to him. It was a legal document where Martha and I would designate someone we trusted to make decisions for us only if we actually became incapacitated in the future. It would prevent Julian or the Thorns from ever being able to seize control, even if something did happen to us, I said, looking him in the eye. "We don't have any other family we can trust, Pete. Would you be willing to be that person?" Pete didn't hesitate for a single second. He set his coffee down and gripped my hand. "Elias, it would be an honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Martha have been like family to me. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're protected." Having the loyalty of a true friend in the middle of this nightmare was worth more than any piece of property. I left the depot feeling a renewed sense of hope. When I got home, I found Martha in the kitchen, but she wasn't cooking. She was sitting at the table with her smartphone, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "Elias, I've been thinking," she said, not looking up from the screen. "I want you to show me exactly how these security apps work. I want to know how to check the cameras, how to record conversations, and how to upload things to that cloud you mentioned." I was surprised by her sudden interest in the technology, but her eyes were filled with a fierce determination I hadn't seen in years. "I don't want to always depend on you to keep us safe," she said firmly. "If they come back when you're out working, I want to be ready for them." I felt a surge of pride as I sat down beside her. My Martha had always been stronger than people assumed. For the next few hours, we went over everything. I showed her how to activate the discreet recording app with a single swipe and how to monitor the porch cameras in real time. We practiced until she could do it without even thinking. The pain of Julian's betrayal was still there, a sharp, constant ache in both our hearts. We had raised him with love, given him every advantage we could, and yet he had chosen a path of greed and deception. But as we sat there together, arming ourselves with knowledge and technology, that pain was being forged into a cold, hard resolve. "We're ready, aren't we?" Martha asked as the evening shadows began to fill the room. "We are," I promised, holding her hand. That evening, I received a message from Jessica. She informed us that the court had officially accepted our complaint for signature forgery, and a formal investigation into the notary who processed the document was underway. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first real crack in the Thorns plan. However, a few days later, the tense calm we had been living in was shattered. Martin called me from the station, his voice sounding uncharacteristically grim. "Elias, I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. The notary, under pressure from the investigation, admitted that he didn't properly verify Martha's identity because Silas Thorne told him it was an urgent family matter, and that he would personally vouch for the signature. "So the power of attorney is officially dead?" I asked, feeling a rush of relief. "It is," Martin confirmed, "but there's a catch. Now that the legal route is closing for them, Silas is cornered. And a man like Silas is most dangerous when he has nothing left to lose. He's been seen meeting with some fixers, people who don't care much for the law." I hung up the phone and looked at Martha. We had won the first battle, but the real war was just beginning. I could feel it in my bones. They were going to try something desperate, and they were going to do it soon. The next couple of weeks were some of the most nerve-wracking days of my life. It was what you'd call the calm before the storm. We didn't hear a single peep from Julian or the Thorns, which, as my friend Captain Martin warned me, was actually a reason to be more worried. When an enemy goes quiet, it usually means they're busy digging a deeper hole for you to fall into. Martha and I tried to keep our heads down and stick to our daily routines, but we were both on high alert. Every time a car slowed down near our driveway, my heart would lurch. Martha never went anywhere without her phone now, keeping it charged and ready to record at a moment's notice. One afternoon, I was parked at the airport, waiting for a passenger pickup, when my phone rang. It was Jessica Castida. Her voice sounded triumphant but also cautious. "Elias, we've got them," she said. She explained that the notary, Mr. Lopez, had officially cracked under the pressure of the investigation. He'd admitted that the signature verification was a sham, and a handwriting expert had confirmed what we already knew. Martha's signature on that power of attorney was a complete forgery. The document was officially dead in the eyes of the law. I felt a rush of pure relief. "So it's over?" I asked. "Not quite," Jessica warned. "The judge has summoned Julian to testify next week. They're cornered now, Elias, and that makes them dangerous. Keep your eyes open." The moment I hung up, I tried to call Martha to share the good news. I wanted to hear her voice, to tell her we'd won a major battle. It rang and rang. No answer. I waited 5 minutes and tried again. Still nothing. A cold knot of dread formed in the pit of my stomach. Martha always answered her phone, especially lately. I didn't think twice. I canceled the ride I was waiting for and drove toward home as fast as I safely could. On the way, I tried calling Pete, the locksmith, and even Martin, but my mind was stuck on a loop of, what if? As I turned onto our street, My blood turned to ice. Julian's truck was parked right in front of the house, and next to it was a car I'd never seen before. Before I even stopped my car, my phone vibrated with a notification from the security app. I opened the feed and saw Julian, Chloe, and a stranger in a white coat entering the front door. Martha was with them, but she was moving slowly, her head lolling slightly to the side. I immediately called Martin. "They're in the house, Martin. Julian and some others. Something's wrong with Martha." "I'm on my way," Martin said, his voice hard. "Don't go in alone, Elias. Wait for backup." But there was no way I was waiting. My wife was in there, and she clearly wasn't herself. I approached the house cautiously, but instead of the front door, I went to the side window where I could see into the living room without being spotted. What I saw through that glass made me want to tear the house down with my bare hands. Martha was slumped on the sofa, her eyes glazed and unfocused. A man in a white lab coat was taking her blood pressure while Chloe stood over them, filming the whole thing with her phone. Julian was talking animatedly, pointing at Martha as if she were a broken piece of furniture. They were staging it. They were creating evidence to show she was confused and incapacitated. I realized with a jolt of horror that they must have drugged her. I couldn't watch another second. I pulled out my own phone, hit the record button, and burst through the front door. "What the hell do you think you're doing in my house?" I roared. The room went dead silent. The man in the white coat jumped back from Martha, looking like he'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Chloe didn't stop filming, though her hand shook slightly. Julian recovered first, putting on that oily, concerned face again. "Dad, we weren't expecting you. We're just doing a medical checkup on Mom. She's been so confused lately." "Confused?" I shouted, rushing to Martha's side. Her hand was ice cold and trembling. "Martha, honey, can you hear me?" She blinked slowly, trying to focus on me. They tricked me, Elias," she whispered, her voice sounding thick and drugged. "They said you'd been in an accident. Then they made me take some pills." I turned on the man in the white coat. "What did you give her?" The man stammered, looking at Julian for help. "It was just a mild sedative. For her anxiety." She was very agitated. "A sedative without her consent? That's assault." I stepped toward him, and he practically cowered. "And who are you? Let me see your medical license." "Turn off that camera, Chloe," I ordered, but she just kept recording, her face set in a mask of cold greed. "We're documenting her state for her own protection," she snapped. Julian stepped between me and the doctor. "We're not leaving, Dad. We've already called social services. They'll be here any minute to see for themselves that you two can't handle things anymore." He actually had a triumphant smile on his face, thinking he'd finally trapped us. He thought the authorities would walk in and find a confused, drugged woman and a son helping his parents. But then, the sound of sirens filled the air. I saw the flash of blue and red lights against the living room wall. "I think your authorities just arrived," I told Julian. A moment later, Martin and another officer burst into the room, followed closely by Jessica Castida. Jessica didn't waste a second. She went straight to Martha to check on her, while Martin walked right up to the doctor. "Did you give this woman medication without her consent?" Martin asked, his voice low and dangerous. The man in the white coat looked at the handcuffs on Martin's belt and completely fell apart. I didn't want to. They paid me," he blurted out. "I'm not a doctor. I'm an actor from the local theater. They gave me a script and told me what to say. They said it was just a family intervention and there wouldn't be any trouble. Julian's face went from white to a sickly green. "Shut up!" he hissed at the actor, but it was too late. Chloe tried one last time to play the victim. "We were just trying to help," she cried. But Jessica stood up, holding her briefcase like a weapon. "I have medical and psychological reports from actual, accredited professionals, not actors, certifying that Mr. Elias and Mrs. Martha are in perfect health," she said, looking Chloe dead in the eye. "What you've done here today is breaking and entering, elder abuse, and impersonating a medical professional." Martin didn't wait to hear any more. He took out his handcuffs. "All three of you are coming down to the station," he said. As the officers began to lead them away, Julian finally broke. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, sounding like a terrified child again. "Dad, please. Silas told me I had to do it. He said if I didn't get the house, he'd ruin me. I owe him so much money, Dad. I'm desperate." I watched my only son being led away in handcuffs, and I felt a hole open up in my soul that I knew might never heal. But as I turned back to Martha and saw the color slowly returning to her face, I knew I'd do it all again to keep her safe. The paramedics arrived shortly after the police had cleared the scene. A real doctor, one Captain Martin trusted implicitly, examined Martha while Jessica and I sat in our small kitchen, still reeling from the shock of the evening. The sedative they'd given her was relatively mild, thank God, but seeing her so vulnerable, so out of it, was a sight I would never be able to unsee. It felt like a violation of the worst kind, not just of our home, but of her very person. As the effects of the medication began to wear off, Martha's eyes finally started to focus on mine again. She was shivering, her hands trembling as she held a mug of tea, but she was back with us. The doctor assured us she'd be fine with rest, but the emotional scars were another matter entirely. Jessica sat across from me at the table, her expression professional as always, but her eyes were filled with a deep, personal concern. She had become more than just our lawyer over the past few weeks. She was our shield. "Elias, the situation has moved far beyond a simple property dispute now," she said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. "What Julian, Chloe, and that actor did tonight, it's criminal. We're talking about multiple felony charges. Breaking and entering, administering a controlled substance without consent, elder abuse, and impersonating a medical official." I leaned back, the weight of the day pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. I looked around the kitchen, at the tiles I'd laid myself, the cabinets Martha had picked out, the marks on the doorframe where we used to measure Julian's height. "What happens next?" I asked, feeling a hollowness in my chest. "That depends on you and Martha," Jessica replied, leaning forward. "You have the right to press full charges for everything. Given the evidence we gathered on the cameras and the recordings, it's a very strong case. It would likely result in significant prison sentences, especially for Julian and the Thorns, who clearly orchestrated the entire charade." Prison. The word felt like a physical blow to my gut. Even after everything he'd done, the lies, the attempt to steal our home, the literal drugging of his own mother, the thought of my only son in a cell broke my heart into a million pieces. I looked at Martha, who was resting on the sofa in the other room, and I saw the same agonizing conflict written across her face. We had spent 35 years trying to raise him to be a man of character, and this was where it had led him. How could we send our own flesh and blood to prison? But then, how could we let him get away with what he'd done? That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the old armchair by Martha's bedside, watching her breathe and listening to the quiet of a house that felt incredibly fragile now. My mind drifted back to the early days, to the sound of Julian's laughter echoing in the yard I'd spent so many weekends tending. I remembered the pride I felt when he graduated, thinking we had successfully set him on a good path. Somewhere along the way, that path had twisted. We talked for hours as the sun began to peek over the horizon. A long, painful conversation about duty, love, and the reality of our situation. By morning, we had reached a decision. It wasn't an easy one, and it certainly wasn't a happy one, but it was the only way we could see a path forward that didn't involve destroying what was left of our family. We met Jessica and Captain Martin at the police station a few hours later. The atmosphere in the station was clinical and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the home we were trying to save. Julian, Chloe, and the actor were still being held in the lockup, awaiting their formal processing. "We've decided how we want to handle this," I told Martin and Jessica once we were settled in the captain's office. "We don't want Julian to go to prison. We can't be the ones who put him there." Jessica started to protest, her legal mind already calculating the risks. "Elias, if there are no serious consequences, people like the Thorns don't stop. They'll see it as a weakness." "I didn't say there wouldn't be consequences," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I felt. "We want to offer him a deal, a very specific, very strict deal. If he wants to avoid a long sentence, he has to completely distance himself from Silas Thorne and that entire family. He has to divorce Chloe, if that's what it takes to get away from their influence. He has to get an honest job, support himself, and prove, through his actions, that he's taking responsibility for his life. And most importantly," Martha added, her voice shaky but determined, "we want to proceed legally against the Thorns. They are the real architects of this nightmare. They manipulated our son, they pressured him, and they turned him into a stranger to us. We want them to face the full weight of the law." Martin and Jessica exchanged a long, meaningful look. "I can talk to the district attorney's office," Jessica said finally. "But for a case against Silas Thorne to stick, we need more than just our recordings. We need an insider. We need Julian to cooperate and testify against them. Silas is a man who knows how to keep his hands clean, while others do his dirty work. I'll talk to him," I said, standing up. A few minutes later, I was sitting in a small, windowless interrogation room. The door opened, and Julian was led in by an officer. He looked haggard, with deep, dark circles under his eyes and an expression of total, crushing defeat. He slumped into the metal chair across from me, unable to even meet my gaze. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the ghosts of 35 years of memories. "Dad," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Listen to me carefully, Julian," I said, cutting him off before he could offer an excuse I wasn't ready to hear. I laid out the conditions Martha and I had set. I explained that this was his one and only chance to avoid a prison cell, but it required him to do something he'd been terrified of: standing up to Silas Thorne. "We need you to testify, Julian," I said, leaning over the table. "You need to tell the truth about Silas, about the forgery, about the plans they had for our house and this neighborhood. You need to tell the DA how they pressured you and how this entire medical evaluation was staged." Julian looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, scared, lost, and searching for a way out of a mess he'd created. I'm not going to jail," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not if you do exactly what we've laid out," I replied, my heart aching as much as my head. But understand this, Julian. This is your very last chance. If you ever betray us again, if you ever try a stunt like this or allow those people back into your life, there will be no more mercy. None. He started to cry then, real tears that seemed to wash away some of the arrogance he'd worn like a mask for months. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "I got carried away. Silas promised me so much. A title, money, and a life where I wouldn't have to break my back working like you did. He made it all sound so easy. That's the root of it, son," I said, feeling a mix of sadness and a tiny, fragile spark of hope. "You've spent your whole life looking for the easy way out. But life doesn't work that way. Anything gained without effort isn't valued, and anything built on lies will eventually crumble." He nodded slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I'll do it. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything about how Silas planned the whole thing from the start." I stood up to leave, the interview over. "Jessica Castida will be in shortly to take your formal statement. Don't leave anything out, Julian." As I reached the door, he called out to me, his voice small and full of fear. "Dad, do you think you and Mom will ever be able to forgive me?" I stopped at the door, my hand on the cold metal handle. I didn't turn around. "Forgiveness isn't a gift you just get, Julian. It's something you earn with actions, not with words," I told him. "Show us over the next few months who you really are. Then, and only then, will we talk about forgiveness." I walked out of that room and into the hallway where Martha was waiting. We held each other for a long time, the weight of the decision still heavy on us. The immediate threat to our home was gone, but the road to healing our family was going to be a long, difficult climb. The weeks following that day at the police station were some of the most intense and emotionally draining times we had ever faced. It was a period defined by a strange, heavy quiet in our house, broken only by phone calls from Jessica or meetings with the district attorney's office. Even though the immediate threat of losing our home had passed, the air still felt thick with the aftermath of what had happened. We were no longer just a retired couple living out our golden years. We were witnesses in a criminal investigation against our own son's in-laws and, by extension, our son himself. Julian stayed true to the promise he made in that interrogation room. It wasn't easy for him. Every time he sat down with the DA to give another statement, he had to admit to his own weaknesses and the ways he had allowed Silas Thorne to manipulate him. But with every word he spoke, he was helping us build a wall of legal protection that no one would ever be able to climb again. Using his testimony, alongside the recordings I'd made on my phone and the security camera footage, the DA was able to build a massive case against Silas and Evelyn Thorne. They were prosecuted for a laundry list of crimes: forgery of legal documents, attempted fraud, coercion, and even being accessories to the unauthorized administration of a controlled substance. The actor they had hired also talked quite a bit to save his own skin, detailing exactly how they had coached him to play the part of a doctor to make Martha look incompetent. Seeing the Thornes' names in the legal filings alongside such ugly charges was a shock to the community. But for us, it was finally a sense of justice being served for the terror they had put us through. While the legal gears were turning, Martha and I realized we couldn't just focus on the house. We had worked our whole lives to build a small safety net, and that included a modest plot of land on the outskirts of town that we'd bought years ago, hoping to one day build a tiny cabin for our retirement. Martha was the one who brought it up one evening while we were sitting on the porch. "Elias, if they were willing to go after this house, they definitely knew about the land," she said, her voice filled with a new, sharp wisdom. She was right. We immediately called Pete, the locksmith, and had him go out there to change the gate locks and install a few solar-powered trail cameras. We weren't leaving anything to chance anymore. We were learning that being strong meant being prepared, and Martha was leading the charge. She spent her afternoons becoming a master of our security system, ensuring she knew exactly how to monitor every inch of our property from her phone. As for Julian, he followed through on the hard part of the deal. Chloe, seeing that her husband was now a lead witness against her parents, didn't wait around for things to get better. She filed for divorce almost immediately and moved back into the Thorns estate, likely hoping to salvage whatever was left of their family reputation. Julian didn't fight her on it. He seemed to finally realize that the life they had been building was a house of cards founded on Silas's greed. Julian moved into a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the far side of the city. He didn't ask us for a penny, which was the first sign that he was truly trying to change. With a little help from my friend Pete, who had a cousin working at the local transport cooperative, Julian managed to land a job as an administrative assistant. It was a far cry from the executive role Silas had promised him, and the pay was modest, but it was honest work. For the first time in his adult life, he was standing on his own 2 feet without looking for a shortcut. Months passed before we felt ready to see him again. The first meeting happened at a neutral little coffee shop downtown. Not our home and not his apartment. It was awkward and quiet at first. We didn't know what to say to the man who had almost destroyed us, and he seemed too ashamed to look us in the eye. But as we sat there, he began to tell us about his job. He talked about the long hours, the difficult paperwork, and the satisfaction of earning a paycheck that wasn't tied to someone else's manipulation. "It's not easy, Dad," he admitted, finally looking up at me. "But I feel like I'm finally doing the right thing." There were no big, cinematic hugs that day. There were no grand declarations of all is forgiven. The hurt was still too fresh, and the trust had been shattered into too many pieces to pick up all at once. But it was a beginning. It was a tentative, fragile step toward rebuilding something from the ruins. Little by little, through his actions rather than just his words, Julian was beginning to show us that he understood the lesson we had tried to teach him. That an inheritance isn't a right you're born with, but something earned through character, loyalty, and hard work. In the background, the Thorns' world was crumbling. While they managed to avoid actual prison time through some expensive legal maneuvering, the damage was done. They were hit with massive, soul-crushing fines that drained their accounts, and Silas's business reputation was in tatters. Word of the shady inheritance case spread through the business community like wildfire, and he lost several of his most important contracts. They were still wealthy, perhaps, but they were no longer the influential people they had pretended to be. They were just people who had tried to steal from a couple of retirees and lost. One evening, as the first signs of spring began to show in the garden, Martha and I sat out on the porch, watching the sunset. Our house, our modest, decent little home, stood firm behind us. It was more than just bricks and mortar now. It was a symbol of our endurance. "You know, Elias," Martha said, resting her head on my shoulder, "sometimes I think this whole nightmare had to happen." I looked at her, surprised. "Why do you say that, honey?" "Because Julian was lost," she said softly. "He was chasing ghosts. He needed to hit rock bottom to finally see the ground he was standing on. And we needed to remember that we're still the same people who built this life from nothing. We're stronger than we thought." I squeezed her hand, feeling the strength in her fingers. She was right. We had faced the worst kind of betrayal and come out the other side with our dignity and our home intact. We were tired, yes, but we were whole. A few more months passed, and the world began to feel a little lighter. One afternoon, as the air grew warm with the coming of spring, Martha and I found ourselves sitting on our small front porch, just as we had done 1,000 times before. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple that looked like a masterpiece brushed across the heavens. Martha reached over and took my hand, her fingers interlaced with mine. She looked at me with those eyes that, after more than 4 decades together, were still the only compass I ever needed to find my way home. In that quiet moment, with the neighborhood settling into its evening hum, she spoke what had been on both of our minds. "You know, Elias," she said softly, "sometimes I think all this pain and worry, maybe it actually had to happen." I looked at her, a bit surprised, but she continued with that quiet wisdom that had always been her greatest strength. Maybe Julian needed to hit rock bottom to finally find his own path. Maybe he needed to see the darkness to appreciate the light. I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of the past year settle in my bones. "Maybe," I replied, a part of me still mourning the version of my son I thought I knew. "I just wish we didn't have to suffer so much to get him there. I hate that you had to go through that, Martha." "Suffering builds character, Elias," she said, quoting something she'd believed her whole life. "The important thing is that, in the end, we all learned something." Julian finally learned about consequences and what it means to be responsible for your own life. She paused, looking at our house, the modest, sturdy little building we had fought so hard to keep. "And us? We learned that we are a lot stronger than we ever gave ourselves credit for." I nodded, leaning back and watching the last of the sunlight dance on the leaves of the old oak tree. "And we learned that what we built together, the real stuff no one can take away from us," I added. "Not Silas Thorne, and not even our own son." Behind us, our house stood firm, a silent witness to a lifetime of shared struggles and hard-won triumphs. It had seen the lean years when we barely had enough for groceries, and it had seen the years of plenty when the yard was full of laughter. It was more than just walls, a roof, or a deed held in a legal trust. As I sat there holding Martha, I finally understood what our true legacy was. It wasn't the physical property or the money in our savings account. Our true legacy was the life of honesty we had lived, the decades of hard work we had put in, and the unbreakable love that had kept us standing when everything else tried to pull us down. That was something that couldn't be forged on a notary's paper or stolen through a drugged sedative. It was a treasure built one day at a time, and it was ours forever. Julian still has a long road ahead of him. He's still working that administrative job, living in his small apartment, and slowly learning how to be a man of his word. He visits us sometimes, and while the hugs aren't quite as tight as they used to be and the trust is still being mended, there is hope. We're taking it one day at a time, showing him through our actions what it means to be a family that looks out for one another the right way. The thorns have faded into the background of our lives, their influence neutralized by the law and their own greed. They taught us a hard lesson about the world, but in doing so, they only made our bond stronger. We don't spend our nights looking over our shoulders anymore. We spend them enjoying the peace we earned through 40 years of sweat and a few months of fierce, protective fire. As the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, leaving only a faint glow in the sky, I felt a deep sense of peace. The war was over, our home was safe, and our family was, in its own broken and beautiful way, starting to heal. If this story touched your heart or gave you something to think about, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it.